Yeah, and if you've ever had a conversation with somebody who's had an emotional response,
Yes.
you don't want to go through that again.
No.
Yeah, you're like, I'd rather just not have this conversation because you might get dramatic, start crying. It might be a full-blown thing, and then it becomes about that person versus the issue that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And so if you're dealing with somebody with that kind of personality, you might be like, I don't want to have this conversation. It's going to lead to nowhere.
Yeah.
And so the rejection you're already sensing, and you kind of have an idea of how it's going to end. So you just kind of tell yourself, we don't really need to have this conversation.
Hey, Julie.
Hey, Taryn.
So today we are talking about communication barriers and some reasons why we might find it difficult to have a conversation with someone or why we might be dreading the talk. So I don't know about you, but do you find that for you, is it hard to have difficult conversations with people?
I think now I'm the person everyone calls to have the difficult conversations and initiate those conversations. But I can say for sure that when I was younger, I avoided it at all cost.
Really? Yeah, I think it varies from season to season probably in life, and also the people that you're having to talk with. Like, who is it, right, that you're having those difficult conversations? And I want to dig into that a little bit. Like, what are the reasons why we might find it difficult? And the first one that I want to kind of dig into is a history of rejection.
Yeah. So if you have a history with somebody or attempting to talk to somebody or having a difficult conversation with that person, but you've been shut down, especially if you're trying to express some emotional things or your opinion, and they've shut you down, you're probably less likely to have that conversation again.
Sure.
And because you kind of predict, well, this last time I had this conversation, this is how it ended.
Yeah.
So you assume that's how it's going to end this time around. Not that could be wrong. You probably could be accurate in that.
Yeah.
But it creates a little bit of anxiety. And you're like, I don't want to have this conversation. I already know how this is going to play out. So that rejection really does hinder people from wanting to have the talk.
Yeah, absolutely. Or you think about maybe the way that you grew up, and if there wasn't maybe a safe environment for you to have a difficult conversation, or for you to bring your problem or a need that you have as a child, you feel that rejection and maybe even anxiety or fear to be able to discuss something. And I think that can have an impact.
Yeah. And if you've ever had a conversation with somebody who's had an emotional response,
yes,
you don't want to go through that again.
No.
Yeah. You're like, I'd rather just not have this conversation because you might get dramatic, start crying. It might be a full-blown thing. And then it becomes about that person versus the issue that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And so if you're dealing with somebody with that kind of personality, you might be like, I don't want to have this conversation. It's going to lead to nowhere.
Yeah.
And so the rejection you're already sensing, and you kind of have an idea of how it's going to end. So you just kind of tell yourself, we don't really need to have this conversation.
Yeah. I think about, whether it's a spouse or a family member, and if there really is a goal that you have in mind, part of it is thinking about what is that goal and what do I want to try to accomplish in the conversation, and is it the right time? We've talked about this in other episodes that we've done, is timing with it too. But ultimately, if the need needs to be communicated, you're going to have to find a way to be able to have that conversation.
Well, I think when you assume and predict, I've had this conversation multiple times, it always ends a certain way. What happens is that person that you're trying to have the conversation with has robbed power from you. Because as long as you'll avoid the conversation, it's never been had, the other person has the power.
Yeah.
And so it makes a person feel powerless because they want to communicate, but then you have a person who's just trying to shut you down, make you think you're crazy.
Yeah.
What you're feeling is invalid. This is not how family operates. This is not how work operates. This is not how we've done it in the past. There's all these excuses. And so it makes a person think maybe what I'm feeling is not accurate. Like it's not the right way to feel. And then you have the rejection on top of that.
Yeah. It almost like, I know we'll talk about this another time, but it almost kind of reminds me of some narcissistic type of behavior, right? Because that person, if you're not able to operate and say what you need to say, that other person remains having the power in a situation, which they're comfortable with.
Well, most people who have difficulty having conversations have been around, grown up and been around narcissistic people with more narcissistic tendencies.
Sure.
So that's probably where it's stemming from originally anyway.
Yeah.
A person who doesn't wouldn't automatically reject you, and you wouldn't have that memory of rejection.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean they have to understand you, but to say, I don't know why you're feeling that way, it's invalid, or no, that's not going to be a possibility, those type of things that you're assuming is going to happen. You've probably had or attempted this conversation multiple times.
Yeah. Another reason I think, aside from, fear of being rejected, part of it too is, we might overthink or second guess the response. And so when we overthink something, then we're caught up in the anxiety and thinking all throughout, what the responses would look like. And so that might be another reason why you might avoid the conversation.
Okay, everybody overthinks it because I definitely think about, well, what if they say this? What am I going to say? Well, what if they say this? How am I going to come back with that? So you're trying to prepare for every possible situation that could happen.
Sure.
And you guys know this. After a conversation, we come back and we're like, I should have said this. Should have said that. I should have brought this up.
A heated argument.
I should have brought this up. I should have thrown this in their face. And you think about all the reasons. So when you overthink it, you're thinking of all the possibilities that this could take.
Sure.
And probably a lot of them are probably bad. It could go
they're likely negative, right? Man, I had an opportunity to make another jab and I missed it.
Yeah. So when you're overthinking it, you're thinking of all the possibilities that could happen and how you could answer. Nobody ever thinks about this could go really well. We don't think that. We don't think that someone's going to support us. And like I said, with the cycle of possibly talking to the same person, you kind of know their personality. You probably can assume that. Like I've had bosses that way. Where you're like, I already know how this is going to go. They're going to brush this off like it's not a big deal.
Yeah.
So you prepare yourself for it. But I don't avoid the conversation.
Yeah, I'm thinking about myself in those situations. You brought a boss and I was like, oh, that's a good point, because I think about the timing that I would find to approach a boss if it was, depending on what the situation was, right? It's like, okay, is that a 5 a.m. email or is that like a casual conversation down the hallway,
Yeah.
depending on what the topic was.
Yeah. But now I make it a point to be like, hey, this is what's going on. This is what's going to happen. Just throwing it out there. Probably want to do something about that.
Yeah.
And I try to throw the ball in their court.
Sure.
I probably shouldn't have to say anything, but I just want them to know that I know that this is going to happen. And I'm just letting you know that it's going to happen.
You're like, okay, this is on you now.
Yeah.
I've brought it to your attention and do with it what needs to be done.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I bring it up because I think communication is, this is how I feel about the situation. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to do anything. I'm not expecting anything from you, but I am going to tell you how I feel about the situation. And that helps you. If you can get over the rejection and the overthinking, it helps create boundaries.
Well, it also brings a sense of freedom, right? In your communication, you're able to be free of that rejection. And I think for some people, it might be a slower start or just a little bit at a time. And then hopefully you'll be able to experience that with different challenging people.
Yeah. And also learn to navigate through the objections that are coming.
Yeah.
Be prepared for that.
Sure.
Be prepared for the objections. That's why I think overthinking sometimes I'm like, well, they might say this. Well,
it's not a bad thing.
No,
it's not a bad thing. It's almost just like preparing for that conversation.
Yeah. And dealing with the conflict. And also be open to the fact that this may not end the way you want it to end.
Sure.
But what you wanted to communicate was communicated.
Yeah. Yeah. We talk about the rejection. Another area is fear. And I think one reason why, I know for myself too, and I'm sure you might relate to this, and we know a lot of people, but it's about hearing no. Like we might not have a conversation because we don't want to hear the word no. Maybe it's because we have a big dream or a big vision and we want someone else to come on board with our vision, and you hear no. That's not always a bad thing either. That can also help push you forward into what needs to be accomplished.
Yeah. So the problem with the fear of hearing no is if it's somebody that's you really have to depend on or is required to make it happen.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to partner with your spouse and your spouse is like, no, we can't do that, because most spouses make joint decisions.
Yeah.
And you might need some partnership.
Sure.
You may or you may not. It just kind of depends. Whether it be timing, finances, whatever, you want to start a business, whatever that looks like, you need some type of hey, I'm going to come alongside you and do this.
Yeah.
So that can be difficult because if you get a no there, do you just stop or do you keep pursuing other avenues and places to go and to find out to make this dream happen?
Yeah.
The fear of no also, some people feel like that's the end. If they say no, this can't move any further. But that's not always the case either. You just don't want to move further after someone that's important to you says no.
Well, it almost shuts you down, right? And so there's an impact emotionally that you feel like there's a disappointment, right? When we were talking about just preparing for this discussion, I know some of the organizations, businesses that started up, big names, like they heard no multiple times, but yet they still persevered through things. Walt Disney was one that heard no like 300 something times before he was able to get funding, I think, right?
Yeah. So 300 conversations where 300 people are like, no, I'm not investing in this.
Yeah. That's wild to me.
Well, I don't know that I would go 300 no's. I would be like 6 in and be like, I'm good. And that's the difference in people who are successful. They have that grit and that perseverance to push through.
Yeah.
And you have to have a mindset of it doesn't matter what the other person says. I make the decision of how I want to move forward from here.
Yeah.
And so, but the fear is there. The anxiety is there. The anxiousness is there. And that's normal for people to feel that, especially if they've been around people who have shut them down and constantly shut down any dream they have just for the sake of shutting it down. It could even be a good idea.
Yeah.
And they're just like, no. Because of the relationship that's there.
Sure. It could be if there's some kind of tension maybe within the relationship, they don't want to appear supportive, so they shut it down.
Correct.
Yeah. Another area is avoidance of the responsibility. And this is a big one. What are your thoughts on that?
So this gets tricky. Avoidance of responsibility is when you're trying to tell somebody, hey, you said this and you did this and it made me feel this way. And they're like, no.
Just complete denial.
And it's like, no, you don't get to say no. That's actually how I felt. So if you hurt me, you don't get to deny the hurt that I felt.
Yeah, you don't get to deny my feelings.
Yeah. Now, you can explain, hey, you misunderstood me. That was not my intention.
Yeah.
And they can communicate that. But most people that have not matured in that type of conversation will say, I don't know why you're feeling that way. Like you're being dramatic.
Yeah.
Like they'll making you feel that what you're feeling is not valid or you shouldn't be feeling that way at all. And so they're avoiding the responsibility that they hurt you. Or they're avoiding the responsibility they made you angry. They're avoiding the responsibility that they're wrong and they need to apologize. And so if you're dealing with that type of person, which comes along the narcissistic line too.
I was just thinking that, I'm like, why is my brain like always on the narcissistic type thing? Because I'm like, that's someone who's gaslighting you.
Correct.
Like they're totally gaslighting you. If you're saying, hey, this is the way you made me feel. And they're like, what? Like, that's on you. Like, well, I don't know why you're overreacting like that.
Yeah, I think it's hard for us, especially when it's people we love.
Yeah.
Like, think about your grandmother. Like, your grandmother's like sweet and kind, but she can gaslight you. Just kind of, you don't say nothing to your grandmother when she gaslights you. You're like, okay, all right, Granny. And you just kind of move on, right? So it creates an awkward situation because what you wanted to communicate is not being communicated. But when they're avoiding responsibility, what they're trying to do is make you think you felt wrong, you thought wrong, and you're bringing this up and now you're foolish for bringing it up.
Yeah.
But really they're avoiding the fact, they're making you do that so they don't have to apologize. They don't have to take ownership that they made you feel that way.
It's almost a really prideful way to handle it, right? I mean, when you think about someone who's gaslighting you, it's because they don't want to reflect on their own actions or their own words that they've spoken. And so not only is it gaslighting, narcissistic, but it's just someone who's stuck and doesn't want to self-reflect.
Yes, of course.
It's so unhealthy.
It is very unhealthy. And like, let's give an example. If you said to me, Julie, when you said that hurt my feelings, my automatic reaction would be, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. My intention was never to hurt your feelings.
Yeah.
This is why I said that, but maybe I said that. So it brings awareness to me of the sensitivity you have. That would be a normal reaction.
Yeah.
Right? If your child says, you said this and it made me feel this way, you wouldn't just brush it off. Like you're aware of the fact that maybe that communication created something in that person emotionally.
Sure.
But people who avoid responsibility, they'll even joke it off. You'll see people who try to joke it off and act like it was not a big deal. And
it's so hurtful to the other party, though. Like that creates emotional wounds that you have.
And it invalidates your feelings. Your hurt was not that sufficient, and nor was it valid. Therefore, we're going to make a joke out of the situation.
Yeah. Well, and I think if you are self-aware, even if you say something with no intentions of harming, but you realize it after the fact, to apologize, to approach, and because then you're kind of, I don't know, fixing the situation. You're taking responsibility. You're being proactive at that point. I think about my kids and I'm mom, sometimes I get a little loud or I respond out of anger. And it's like, there are times when I've had to turn to my child and say, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry that I got really upset. I'm sorry if it upset you, and I'll do better. And I think part of that is showing your child that it's okay. Number one, too, but we're all human, but we have to take responsibility. Like we have to. It creates a safe place in the relationship.
Yeah. So if you're dealing with somebody that doesn't do that, you have to be very well mentally prepared when having the conversation.
Yeah.
Because what you have to be able to stand and say is, hey, like, you may not think it's a big deal, but it is a big deal to me.
Yeah.
And you continue to communicate. Don't shut down. You continue to communicate, because then you take that power away from them. To say, hey, you may not want to apologize to me, but what you did hurt me. So I'm just letting you know that.
Yeah.
And it's almost scary for the other person, because you're highlighting the flaw, you're highlighting the error, you're highlighting the mistake.
Sure.
And people like them never make mistakes. They're always right. And so they don't like that. And so even if somebody makes a joke about something and I say, that's not something to joke about, I'm being serious. And then it creates this level. But it's just, it's not to gaslight them. It's to let them know, I need you to know that you may be laughing about this right now, but it's very serious to me, and it is a problem in our relationship.
Yeah.
So I think taking power back and to continue to communicate is a good way if you're dealing with that type of person.
Yeah, absolutely. And that just reminds me, which we're going to talk more about this on another talk, but that's kind of a good way to draw some of the boundaries within the conversations. And at that point, that individual is like, maybe they'll check themselves, right? The next time you go to have a conversation. And I think that, like you said, it's taking the power away from them, but it allows for maybe the next time you're in a better position to have a healthier conversation with them, where they're not, kind of pushing that boundary unnecessarily.
Yeah. And usually people who are afraid of these type of conversations with certain people, it's because the other person gets to draw the boundary, redraw the boundary, draw the boundary, redraw the boundary, and you have no control over it.
Yeah.
So this is a way for you to kind of take that boundary back.
Sure.
Because you get to draw your boundaries.
Yeah.
And so in the communication, and they might, at that point, I've seen this happen, the other person gets afraid of a conversation. So then when you get bolder, like I'll text people, hey, me and you need to talk. And and they're like, I was anxious the whole time before I was coming. I'm like, well, I mean, because now we've established that I'm going to have clear communication with you. Therefore, that's going to happen.
I mean, that is kind of bold. I mean, I might be a little like, oh, what you want to talk about? Like, you at least got to give some kind of hint, though.
No, because you know what you're going to do? You're going to overthink it. And so I'm not giving you the opportunity to overthink it. And people say, is it bad? People always text me that, like, is it bad?
They're trying to mentally prepare.
Did I do something wrong? And like, they're trying to mentally prepare because they want to have a comeback, an excuse.
Sure.
But I find when I get people off guard about something, it gives a more raw, authentic response of what happened, what's going on. And I always do communicate with a desire to understand, not to defend myself or get my point across, but like I want an understanding as well. So I think that's important. Like, don't go in guns blazing. Like, go with the need of like trying to understand.
And I think that should be really the goal from this whole conversation. Is the goal should be to go in to have understanding, not to go in, like you said, firing away out of emotion. That's so good.
I mean, you could also bring me chocolate and it might go a lot better too. But we
speak the same love language here.
We do. So I think it's just important that if you're afraid to have a conversation with somebody, that you need to teach yourself mentally that there's no winning or losing here. It's more about, did I get my point across?
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that person has to accept it and be okay with it. That's irrelevant. Is the point, has the point been set? Has the boundary been drawn?
Yeah.
And you can walk away feeling empowered in that type of situation.
And in a healthier place with your relationship with that person.
Correct.
Yeah.
They might be afraid though.
They could, but clearly there was things that were off balance and with the relationship anyways. So there need to be some rebalancing.
Yeah, and that person can learn a little bit about you as well as you're changing and evolving because maybe they need to set boundaries too.
Yeah.
So I think it's a good way when people start changing and you notice someone's changing and their personality's changing. I think it's good to be like, hey, what are you doing? It's obviously you're in a healthier place. You're thriving. Like, what's going on? And setting those boundaries and being clear in your communication can be one of those.
Yeah. We'll talk more about boundaries. We're kind of tiptoeing into some boundary stuff. We'll talk more about that in the next one, but this is really good. So just being more aware really of how we have the conversations, and the goal is to understand. So good.